when the average person thinks about climate change and when they think about national security, they're kind of separate issues. Climate change is an environmental issue and national security is like a defense issue. So where do the two intersect?
Right. Well, the two are very clearly connected, and the best way to explain it is through the concept of a threat multiplier. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world, and indeed even today within our own country, as we see sea levels rise, wildfires become a regular occurrence, sea ice retreat in the Arctic, droughts increase across Africa and the Sahel. So these now become security situations. We're living in the largest wave of global migration since World War II. Much of that is aggravated by climate change, whether it's drought, coastal areas becoming inundated, unable to support the megacities of South Asia, the wildfires we see burning across Australia, much of the US, even Russia. So conditions are changing, putting people on the move, putting their food and water security at risk.
So how does that translate, I guess, into a national security issue? So let's say from the standpoint of the United States, how does that affect national security then?
Well, when we are deployed overseas, it affects national security because in places like Africa, where food and water have become more scarce because of climate change, both in places like Darfur and other parts of the Sahel, we see vulnerable populations then being taken advantage of by terrorist groups like Boko Haram and others. In Syria, for example, there was a prolonged drought that preceded the deadliest conflict of modern times. And during that prolonged drought, farmers and herders that had lived peaceably in the countryside could no longer farm their fields, tend to their herds, and they moved towards the urban areas where food and water became scarce and civil unrest grew, and then other political forces took advantage of it. In our own country, we've seen these very destructive hurricanes along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts in the last few years that are now threatening to ravage entire cities. They've taken down military bases. Last year, a major Air Force base in Florida and another one in North Carolina suffered billions of dollars of damage. So it's degrading our military infrastructure at home, also affecting readiness of our troops. You know, temperatures are higher now, and when it's over 90 degrees with a certain level of humidity, our troops can't train or deploy without putting their own health at risk. We call that a Black Flag Day. And the number of Black Flag days is growing significantly, which means that we have to protect the health of our troops or put their lives further at risk. So, and it also affects how our weapon systems operate. As temperature rises, the density altitude curves that determine how aircraft can lift off and fly in temperature changes, which means that you need more fuel to operate for the same distance.
So jumping back to what you mentioned about the environmental migration and climate refugees, it sounds like that's already happening. Do we have projections for like how severe this is going to get in the coming decades?
Yes. I mean, depending on whether we're able to mitigate some of the changing climate and whether temperatures continue to rise well above 2 degrees and 4 degrees. In fact, we did just earlier this year with the Center for Climate and Security, another think tank with which I'm affiliated, we did the first net climate security assessment threat assessment of climate change, looking at 2 and 4 degree scenarios and what the impacts would be on global migration, on food and water insecurity in regions around the world. And it's very clear that as we move from 2 to 4 degrees, these areas, particularly Africa and parts of Asia, are highly vulnerable in the megacities that will be inundated. Think of Manila, parts of China, parts of Bangladesh, and parts of India, and not to mention the small Pacific Island states whose existential existence is already threatened by climate change in the form of both sea level rise and first probably loss of their fresh water sources, to the point that countries like Kiribati have already purchased land in Fiji because they know they will have to relocate parts of their population.
Yeah, so where do these people go? Like, how do we solve this crisis?
Well, we don't yet have global solutions, and we need them. We have a responsibility to prepare and prevent. Let's talk about what's happening, let's say, in our own country. In the US, we have already several types of climate migrants. We've moved towns in Alaska. We moved the whole village of Newtok, Alaska, of about 400 people when their coastal village, because of rising waters along the river, broke through their dock, inundated their fresh water supply, and they lost a number of buildings. They relocated 9 miles upriver, a village of about 400 people at quite a bit of federal expense. Also in southern Louisiana, the bayou is creeping, and the Gulf of Mexico is moving up into the bayou, and the village of Ile St. Charles is also at risk. And there are several other communities around the country, smaller communities at this point, coastal communities from Alaska to Louisiana, but there will be more. In the Pacific Island nations are trying to negotiate land rights, either in Fiji, New Zealand, Australia. There are important questions of what happens to their sovereignty if they have to relocate. And so there's a need to develop a more global framework to address this and to take action now to mitigate the worst effects of climate change.
I mean, I guess Hurricane Katrina could also be an example as well, where we saw, really intense storm surge and a powerful hurricane that maybe we hadn't seen before, hadn't seen since then. So that was a number of years ago. What's happening now? Where have you seen progress in dealing with climate change as a national security issue, in DC or around the world?
Well, we've had progress in New Orleans after Katrina, and in New York and that tri-state area after Hurricane Sandy, because those communities then demanded assistance both from the federal government and then reworked their communities to make them more resilient to the worst effects of climate change as understood at the time. Okay, so we know a lot more today about how historical records are no longer accurate to predict what was a 100-year flood. Now that's almost an annual flood. We know even more now than we knew 10 years ago from Katrina. So we need to build back to better standards or relocate. Those are very hard decisions. For example, the Air Force is rebuilding Tyndall Air Force Base in the Panhandle of Florida now at great expense. There are good questions, and it's going to it's going to build back the roofs of the hangars for the aircraft to make them withstand higher winds that destroyed them in the last hurricane. Now, there are also important questions about whether, you should think about keeping those types of missions in those geographic locations. But those are always very hard, whether it's a military base or a community. People tend to want to stay where they are. So this requires creative, constructive, citizen-based solutions, but that are also supported by governments at various levels. And, we're living through this now with the pandemic, where we see that, the solutions for any one community have to be tailored. What New York City needs is not necessarily exactly the same as what's needed in a rural community in the South or the West. But nonetheless, both communities need testing. They need contact tracing. They're going to need support from their state and federal governments. And that's where we are today. We see in some of the most progressive communities, in places like Boston and in New York and in parts of California and even in parts of the coastal South, where the effects of climate change are real and here today, that people are acting now to build resilience. Resilience takes a lot of forms. Resilience could be not putting the generator in the basement because it might flood, but putting it on a higher floor. Resilience can be planting more mangroves and natural infrastructure along the coast so that the storm surge doesn't come in, and redesigning the beaches in certain ways. Resilience can be what are the human connections and relationships you've established in your community so that when you do have the next flood, hurricane, extreme weather event, people are more clearly connected, and let's say those more at risk, the elderly or those with pre-existing conditions, will not be left alone and isolated. We're learning today so much about how the isolation that's required to protect us from COVID puts people who are already at risk even in more vulnerable situations.
How do you think the COVID-19 crisis will affect climate change? Because, we're starting to see yesterday the news broke of the negative oil prices, the supply of oil's really high. Is that going to be cheap oil for the next couple of years? How's this going to play into the bigger picture? Or do you think there are going to be positive consequences that come out of this?
Well, I certainly hope there are positive consequences. I think we can use this as a fundamental pivot towards a low-carbon, clean energy economy. We already see in the U.S. now that wind is electricity from wind is outpacing coal and other forms of energy on a daily basis with increasing rapidity.
Is that in terms of like price point, or is that in terms of energy generation?
Both. Both. And so wind and solar and the transition to electric vehicles and to more resilient grids that can accommodate new forms of energy such as wind and solar and new batteries. This is all happening real time. And we need to use this opportunity to make our communities more resilient and also to create the jobs that we need to reset our economy. The new jobs are not in coal. The new jobs are in wind and solar and batteries and distributed grids. And there are a lot. We're going to need to put people back to work. We should use this opportunity. And I co-wrote a piece that ran in The Hill, a publication, The Hill, a few days ago, calling for creation of a Citizens Energy and Environmental Corps, modeled after the New Deal Civilian Conservation Corps, which put vast number of Americans back to work with public support during the Depression as a way to help rebuild our country. And now we still have the benefits of that. I cross every summer. I drive from Washington, D.C., where I live, to Cape Cod, where my mother lives. And when I cross that bridge to get onto Cape Cod, and I'm so happy I'm finally on Cape Cod, that bridge was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. And that put Americans back to work doing constructive infrastructure. So we need to do this. We have the opportunity to do the same to rebuild our natural and built infrastructure in more resilient ways for the clean energy economy.
So I guess my concern there, or my, playing devil's advocate, I think after all this, maybe do you think people might be a little bit reticent or afraid to sort of jump into something that seems new? Like the idea of jumping into renewables to many might seem as if like a bit of a risk after a pandemic like this. So do you think people will see that as a risk, or do you think they'll say, okay, we need to do something different this time?
Well, Joe, that is a great question, but let me tell you that the growth in jobs in wind and solar far outpaces the growth in jobs in fossil energy today. So we need to continue the trend that we're already in. We're already on the positive glide slope with respect to bringing more renewables into the market. But we need to keep pushing in that. Otherwise, they'll continue to stay small. We need to increase the percent of our electricity we get from renewables, and then we need to improve our grid and re-engineer our transportation system in this country.
I hope that continues even with the extremely low gas prices, oil prices, right? I just hope that doesn't convince us.
Right. Obviously, there's going to be pushback in everything. And, the other important part is in the global way, and we talk about our national security, what's enabled the United States in part to be a global leader has been our prowess in science and technology. That has been a fundamental foundation of our global leadership since World War II. From engines to the internet, to GPS, to satellites, to the space, in every domain we've led. And in the last decade, our investment in America's science and technology has begun to decline relative to China, to parts of Europe and other industrialized nations. We need to continue that leadership. And much of that's done in our universities, it's done in our labs, and we need to continue that. And then we need to focus on the transition to market. That's where we often run into a gap. We call it the valley of death. You get good technology, good science ideas coming out of universities and labs, but they need to make the transition into actual use, where it's practical for Americans and for others, and for us then to be a leading exporter of clean energy technologies. That will help America's competitive advantage economically around the world.
Do you think there's currently the leadership for that in politics to pivot from like an oil-based economy to a clean energy economy, especially when there's some people in the government who do deny climate change?
Yes, but those numbers are falling, and people on both sides of the aisle now increasingly realize that climate is real, that clean energy provides opportunities for innovation and for jobs, and they want to help their citizens, their districts, their constituents make that transition. People frame it in different ways in different places, geographically, but many times they're all beginning to work towards the same goal. I'm hopeful that one of the future stimulus packages will take up this concept that we've put forward of a citizens' energy and environmental core, and will focus on the resilient infrastructure that we need to rebuild our economy for a low-carbon future.
So obviously right now, I think probably the pandemic is at the top of everyone's, agenda or schedule. That's my dog. But before this, let's say, what did you see climate change sort of slowly getting up in the ranks of what's important to talk about, in DC or, in the Beltway? Has it come to the point where it's sort of like a number one priority, or at least in the top three?
I'd say it's certainly been, I've seen it in polls, be in the top 5, certainly in the top 10. And I think that it's increasingly a key element. Certainly in the Democratic campaigns, it's a key element. Has been among all the candidates, and certainly among Joe Biden, who's leading on that score. He's getting a lot of good support also from Bernie and his voters and supporters and others. And I think, but I increasingly see many Republicans. There's a bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus in the House. There's a bipartisan Senate Climate Caucus now. So increasingly you see Congress and other leaders, and certainly the leadership in the U.S. in the last few years in this area has been at the state and local level and in the private sector. I expect that to continue at least, for the rest of this year, but we'll see what happens in November.
So you recently wrote an article about the Trillion Tree campaign and the US involvement in that and what it would take. Could you kind of describe the connections between the Trillion Tree campaign and defense?
Sure. So, the U.S. Department of Defense is the second largest land manager in the United States with over 30 million acres of land. And thanks to the way in which the military has used this land over many years, it's been protected from development because it's used for training primarily, used for housing some troops. But our military bases have become islands of nature. And they have a very a large collection of endangered species. In fact, there's a greater extent of endangered species on military lands than almost any place in the U.S., from the endangered desert tortoise, which makes its home on the Army's National Training Center and the Marine Corps' 29 Palms maneuver range, in the Mojave Desert, to the red-cockaded woodpecker, which makes its nest in the longleaf pine. The largest stand of the longleaf pine left in the United States is on Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and that longleaf pine is on many other military bases in the Southeast as well. So our military has learned to train with and protect endangered species and use that as part of realistic training. And we also have forested lands on military bases, many forested lands that can be used constructively. As we know that our trees are a great source of carbon sink. While it's not the whole solution to the climate challenge, it's certainly an important element. We see whole countries like Ethiopia last year having major tree planting initiatives in order to create additional opportunities for carbon to be absorbed through those trees. And we know that the industrial era has led us to deforest many areas that were previously naturally forested. We need to go back to that. And one good way to do that is to use the opportunity available on military lands to plant more trees. Over the last decade, we used federal lands to develop more clean energy. We had a special program to site wind and solar capacity on federal lands. So we can do the same thing for tree planting and help lead by example so that other communities, other states will also take up the opportunity. And Earth Day is a great way to celebrate tree planting. So I'm glad that your organization is involved in that and promoting that around the world. It gets our citizens involved. And there's nothing better than watching your tree grow.
That's for sure. You've sort of touched on it when you're speaking about renewable energies and now the Trillion Tree, but you mentioned something earlier about building up resiliency and seeing that as, bringing the generator up to the top floor or building up these seawalls. But can you touch on a little bit more of like sort of the solutions? Whereas I see those resiliency things as backstops, or they're solving the symptom, not the problem. So what are some of the solutions that we should be looking to sort of mitigate these disasters, these national security issues based around climate?
Well, we need to build in resilience by design. So when we're doing land use planning, urban planning, city planning, the resilience has to be built in from the beginning. And that's our challenge, because in many cases, as I noted, the example of moving the generator from the roof to a higher floor is a retrofit. And what we're doing in many ways now is trying to retrofit existing situations. But where we have the chance, as much as possible, we should be including resilience into the very design. That means understanding if you're doing a new when you're doing a new development or planning in an area, that the historic models for flooding have changed, and you need to account for different models of flooding or temperature, or in the West, wildfires. And that's going to lead to some hard choices in some cases. But you really need to, that's why the responsibility to prepare leads one at the local level to begin to incorporate resilience into your very design effort. A good example is what the Dutch have done. They learned the hard way from disastrous floods they had in the 50s. They built resilience into the design of their very densely populated urban areas, so that when you go to a city in the Netherlands, they don't necessarily try to keep the water out, but they let the water flow in underneath various buildings and cities in ways that we're just beginning to learn about in the United States. And we have, in some cases, because we rely very heavily on our very talented engineers, and we are an engineering culture, we've sometimes over-engineered our solutions with the built infrastructure. And for example, what we learned, in the Mississippi and the Delta and the Everglades, is that the over-engineered solutions can create unintended consequences for the ecosystem down the line. And then the ecosystem is no longer as resilient, doesn't provide the water filtration and the other kinds of resilience barriers that it would if it were more natural. So we need to think of design as both natural and built solutions.
That's interesting, because to me that sounds a bit like accepting the fact that there are some things that we can't change yet, right? So like we're accepting the fact that we have done so much, quote unquote, damage to the environment, and there are some things that we're not going to be able to take back. Is that the thinking?
Well, there are some things we will have to change, but I'd say, for example, this morning, I took my morning walk down on the Potomac River, which I do every day with my dog now, and I get to see great blue herons out there, the majestic great blue herons fishing for their breakfast. And when I first moved to Washington over 25 years ago, there were hardly any great blue herons because the Potomac was so polluted at the time. And now it's a lot cleaner, and that majestic bird has come back. So that's a sign that, we can take a tough situation and make it better. We just have to be deliberate about it, and we have to stick to it. So I have no doubt that with our ingenuity and our innovation, our commitment of citizens and our technology, we can design resilient futures for our communities. And we can act on the responsibility to prepare and protect. And I think that's one of the most important lessons we're learning from the pandemic, is that responsibility to prepare. It's easy to say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Or the sweater is what you put on when your mother is cold. My kids, how many times have my kids said that to me? But it really is true that, we see today, the investment, for example, of FEMA in disaster prevention is minuscule compared to the amount of money they spend on responding to the event. So if you wait till the catastrophe, the bad thing happens, you're always less prepared. But then when you're not in it, you think, oh, I'm going to spend my money somewhere else. No, we have to really take this seriously now. That's what, that's partly what climate hawks, climate advocates have been calling for a number of years. And now we realize this in the pandemic, that, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. We need to act on this, both to save citizens today who are affected by the crisis, get them the testing, the help, the treatment they need from our healthcare community, and at the same time, take seriously the lessons we can learn from this to prepare for the biggest global crisis on our horizon, the climate crisis.
So thinking now about the Arctic, it's heating at 2 times the rate of anywhere else on the planet. And very soon we're going to have almost like a northern ocean between Russia, Canada, and the US. How do you view that from a national security perspective?
Well, I mean, the Arctic is ground zero for the climate impacts on security, because we have a whole new ocean that's opened up in our lifetimes because of climate change, which is enabling the geostrategic competition that we are seeing emerge today for the economic rush to resources available across the Arctic, first in the form of new shipping lanes, as the Arctic is increasingly navigable, and Russia seeks to monetize the Northern Sea Route. That's the route along its shallow Arctic coast, as it has built up capability to operate there both militarily and otherwise, and wants to use that as a way to escort commercial vessels, particularly from Asia across to Europe. At the same time, China is building its Polar Silk Road, an extension of its larger Belt and Road Initiative, seeking to learn how to operate in the Arctic and have capability to operate there in the future, both along Russia's Northern Sea Route and investing with Russia. An important, there's the energy and mineral resources in the Arctic are estimated to be well beyond what's been found in other land locations around the world. So when and if they can be extracted, of course, we don't need that now that oil's in the negative territory. And so maybe we won't be extracting it anytime soon, which is ecologically a good thing. But nonetheless, those investments and that planning and preparation, and, China takes a long-term view. They've always had a long view of the future. They can foresee probably an era decades hence when the Central Arctic Ocean is accessible and could provide a whole new transit route. The U.S. is preparing to operate in a different Arctic as well. There are places between the United States and Russia at its closest point in the Bering Strait. They're only 30 miles apart. This week, we're observing 10 years since the Deepwater Horizon Gulf oil spill, the largest oil spill in America. What if we have an oil spill in the Arctic? Are we prepared for that? And the answer is very clearly we're not. If you think back to Exxon Valdez, which was an Alaskan oil spill, but wasn't actually in the Arctic and was in U.S. waters only, an oil spill in the Arctic would make the Exxon Valdez cleanup, which was very significant, or the Deepwater Horizon cleanup, look easy compared to perhaps the challenge of removing oil from Arctic waters. The transboundary would unlikely be just in one country's waters, Canada, Russia, others, Arctic nations. So we need to plan and prepare for that now, as we've seen increasing vessel traffic with retreating sea ice, sinking permafrost. We also have, we shouldn't forget the indigenous communities that live across the Arctic in the United States and elsewhere. Their lives and livelihoods are very much at risk now because the permafrost no longer supports their traditional way of life. They can't fish and hunt the same way they always have. We've already had communities in Alaska, whole villages having to relocate because they've lost their water supply. The coastal areas have been inundated as the waters moved in.
It's a lot to handle, I guess, in the Arctic there. So what do you see as this, I'm always going to come back to, what do you see as the solution for dealing with an Arctic that's opening up?
Well, let's be clear. We actually, in the U.S. Arctic, we already have a lot of military bases. We've been using our bases in the Arctic, some of which were established going back to World War II as staging areas, because it provides closer access to the Pacific and to Asia. But now, we've used them to defend against potential Russian, Chinese, or North Korean missile threats from bases in Alaska. But now we have to learn also how to operate on the surface from ports. We don't have a deep water port in the United States in our Arctic region, which would, we hadn't thought we needed one because the U.S. Arctic wasn't primarily open for much of the year, but it's increasingly navigable. So that's one of the questions on the table. We have to figure out the right balance now between enabling resilient, innovative development in the region. We see our Nordic partners doing that very much. Norway, Sweden, Finland. They're seeing increasing developed sort of communications capability, development, technology, sustainable development across their Arctic. Our Arctic, the U.S., Alaska has been primarily relied on it. It's been resources have been the primary source of income for the state, from oil and gas to forestry to fishing primarily. And now as we make that transition towards a new economy in that region, and it's very challenging, more challenging in many ways than other parts of the lower 48 because of the remoteness, because of the extreme dependency on oil and gas revenue for so many years. That's going to be even harder now. But at the same time, we need to help our citizens there, and then we need to think about how we position ourselves to operate in an increasingly open region in a way that enables us to continue to do the science and observations. The U.S. has long been a leader in Arctic research, Arctic science. We need to continue that capability, work appropriately with other nations around the world to understand those changes, because that's going to be the key to setting our climate future, is being able to measure and map the ocean, for example, measure the changes. There's an icebreaker of scientists stuck up in the Arctic now very deliberately for almost a year now, with scientists from around the world undertaking an Arctic science expedition. And so we need to continue that type of very important research while we're continuing to manage and try to mitigate what we do elsewhere really affects what happens in the Arctic. As we say, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. If you all are on the East Coast like I am, you may have noticed that we're having an unusually cool April right here in Washington, and probably elsewhere along the East Coast too. And that's partly because the jet stream now meanders more. And as it does, it pushes air down. Right now, we're in a spot of sort of cold air being pushed down. Sometimes it's warmer, and we get all these. We had a mild winter, but sometimes we get the polar vortex that meanders down. So these changes occurring because of long-term climate trends.
So do you think we're kind of at that point where we need to pivot sharply and build a new methodology of doing things?
Well, we've talked a lot about the future we need to have for the planet, for the climate, for people. If we look at history, and some people say, this time now where the world seems upside down with the pandemic where we're all inside, oil prices negative, history is accelerating, perhaps. Now, the question is it changing, or is it just moving faster along its same path? And we also know that things don't change in a straight line. Progress is never linear. In the United States, we are very clearly experiencing that progress in certain directions has been walked back right now. And it doesn't mean that we'll walk back forever, but it means that sometimes 2 steps forward results in 1 or even 2 or 3 steps back. So progress is not linear. I think that we already were in, let's say, on the subjects we're discussing, climate and clean energy, we are already on a path towards excessive concentrations of carbon, whether we can cap it at 2 or 4 degrees. Okay, we've taken a slight dip because of the crisis with less emissions. You can see many cities, China, India, in the U.S., the air is cleaner now. But will that just be temporary? Likely, yes. Well, on the clean energy side, we are already in that transition. So if we can accelerate history in that way, can we accelerate the transition? I certainly hope so. I think that I'm hopeful there are enough lessons to be learned, enough political will that the job growth that's needed coming out of this crisis will be in new sectors. We'll see some sectors won't come back as they will, just as we've seen that, not all of our small businesses will be able to survive, but many of them will. But some sectors of the economy will transition as people are going to do more online. Let's say a lot of retail is not going to be in store as much anymore. And the same in clean energy. Does it mean there's not going to be any coal? No. But we already saw coal on the decline, for example, in the U.S., and I think that will, and in many parts of the world, I think that will continue. Will we begin to pivot away more now from reliance on fossil fuels in electricity production? That's already happening in places like Texas and other states and in the Northeast and California. And I think that could well accelerate. And then transportation, that's the whole, how fast will we get, electric vehicles and make the transition away from the combustion engine and build that infrastructure we need to accommodate that. So those are we're on that trend. Can we accelerate it? That would be a great thing.
And do you think this is kind of an opportunity to start the debate again about a Green New Deal and to try and force legislation through, both in the States or in other developed nations, along the lines of a Green New Deal?
Well, leaving aside what we actually call it, because those words can themselves be, political hot buttons in the U.S. Yeah. So sure. I think that we can and should, and I see support on both sides of the aisle, if you can frame it in a broader way, so some people, on the more moderate to conservative side like to talk about clean energy innovation and technology. Others want to talk about Green New Deal, and there's a lot in between there. Okay, so if you can create a big enough tent but agree on the goals of the transition and the good jobs for Americans, moving towards low carbon in both transportation and electricity, bringing down emissions as a way of doing that, and then recreating the international alliances and partnerships needed to make this matter. That's going to be another thing, because it has to be done in an appropriate international way, rejoining Paris, but then moving even beyond the Paris Climate Agreement to new forms of clean energy partnerships.
Are you hopeful for that?
That was my question as well.
I am hopeful. I'm planning. I have a responsibility to plan and prepare for a better future, and that's one of the things I'm planning on.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us today, Sherri.
Yeah, that was really great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ben and Joe. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed chatting with you,